Okay, everybody, here we are. I just want to give a highlight on this book that I wrote a few years ago. Um, I show up at this TV station back in 2013. It went live that year. The Portuguese TV station RTP. They were actually doing a show about Portuguese natives who are around the world and who live elsewhere. So I was caught in Malaysia. So I ended up showcasing what is it like to live in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur and in the China Sea, like the South China Sea. And also I brought the TV station to Malacca, which is the first city where Europeans set foot more than 500 years ago. It was in 1511. So they founded this Christian city in Malaysia, and they built a fort, and it was an important commercial outpost for several decades, and it set the rule for the whole Southeast Asia. Nowadays, after 500 years, we see a resurgence of this trade, of this mixing of cultures, and all this setup in a region which they call the emerging markets, the emerging regions, where multinational companies are heading to invest and to spread their benefits around a fresh new area. Now, what's exciting is, um, since I show up in this TV station, they asked me to publish this book, which I did. It was called the Chronicles of the Emergent. So the Chronicles of the Emerging Markets were actually focused on my previous life, the previous 10 years overseas from 2005 until 2015, which was a golden period. There was a crisis in between in the US and Europe, but it was a golden period of travel and expansion of multinationals in brand new markets, following the theory of Goldman Sachs, the BRICS, and all these N11, the next 11 emerging economies. And there was a huge trend for investment. So I talked about my experience in Eastern Europe, in the Czech Republic, where I lived 3 years, in Romania, where I lived more than a year, in Germany, I was there almost 2 years as well. So it was a very rich experience of around 6 years in Eastern Europe, between 2004 to 2010. When the crisis hit hard, most of the companies moved to Southeast Asia. Taking from the experience of Eastern Europe, many of them actually went bigger, on a bigger scale, on a bigger region, bigger market, more potential on the long term. So you start to see not just the typical Asian tigers from the 1980s, but actually you start to see countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, even Myanmar and Cambodia coming up strong with the big financial centers in Singapore and Hong Kong, and of course the traditional markets like Japan, Australia, India, Taiwan, South Korea. So this whole region represents more than 60% of the human population and represents a huge boost in terms of economic growth for the whole world, for the whole 21st century. I arrived right in 2010, by the end of 2010, in Malaysia. I lived in Malaysia for 3 years. I worked really hard. I learned a lot. I traveled the whole Southeast Asia and did big business, big experiences, big deals, and I set up companies in different places, different cities like Jakarta, Bangkok, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur. It was really awesome, to the point that I reached the Philippines. I did a study about the Philippines. The Philippines would be the next big growth, so Manila was the next place to be. End of 2013, I was in Manila, and until the crisis of 2020, until the global pandemic, I spent great time. In between, I still went to Portugal for some projects to revive some old acquaintances back in 2019. That was actually the last golden year of travel. All this experience, at least until 2015, I talk about in the Chronicles of the Emerging Markets. The second volume of this trilogy that I decided to set up, the second volume, I'm not sure if it's going to be released by Chiado as well. Chiado released the first one. Chiado publishers are the biggest publishers in Portugal. They publish in several languages, several countries. So Chronicles of the Emergent in English, it's already on the pipeline to be set up, a distribution and sales, of course. Chronicles of the Emergent is nothing more than just a reflection of Eastern Europe and the transition to Southeast Asia, keeping Malacca and Southeast Asia as the center. The second volume of the trilogy should be called The Legends of the Pacific. The Legends of the Pacific talk about the whole Pacific, from Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, and Australia, all the way to Americas, Mexico, California there, Chile, all the way into the Amazon. So all the way from the Spice Islands to the Amazon, which is an amazing territory to be. It's actually the center of gravitation. The center of gravitation of economy moved from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So these are the Legends of the Pacific, which is already down in text. Third volume, the last volume of my written trilogy, of my literary trilogy, I would say. It's the Prophecies of the Empire. What's Prophecies of the Empire? Why empire? Isn't the age of empires over? No. Actually, after 500 years, counting from the conquest of Malacca, on the Chronicles of the Emergent, the Legends of the Pacific open up another set of 500 years, which was Magellan's circumnavigation of the world, which actually ended up in the Philippines, in Cebu. So, makes sense to talk about the Pacific in the Legends of the Pacific with Magellan, as much as it makes sense to talk about the future of empires. The empires will come back. There's going to be a rewriting of history. There's going to be a comeback of the empires. The proof is UK just split from the EU. They don't need the EU. They have their empire. The Commonwealth is the UK's empire. The US have their empire. The United States of America are their empire. Other countries, Spain has their empire. The whole Latin America, Mexico all the way to Argentina, it's a Spanish empire. Portugal, they have a huge empire too, from Brazil to Africa to some places in Southeast Asia. They have the tropics. The Portuguese are known to have the tropical area of their empire too. So slowly, you'll see that the countries will be fed up with this European model of trying to change everyone, trying to globalize everyone by force and by the nature of the law, which doesn't work anyway, because trade is always evolving, and you cannot force everyone to bound by a rule which they don't want to be into. So the world will be moving naturally back to the empires. The age of empires is back. That makes sense. That's why the prophecies of the empire. So Chronicles of the Emerging Markets, it's all about the expansion from the west to the east. The Legends of the Pacific, it's all about the legendary stories that are out there, from Magellan's arrival in the Pacific and crossing that whole huge sea, to the victory of MacArthur in the Second World War, going into several multinationals expanding globally. That's the beauty of the Pacific, the Legends of the Pacific, plus all the treasures that are into it. And then, of course, the prophecies of the empires. The prophecies are there. It's written. It's going to come back. It's all the way into 1,000 years. We're just waiting for it. So guys, this is my trilogy. I hope I share something exciting and motivational with you. All the love for you.